a dismissive laugh from a pilot, a crumpled budget ticket in a young girl's hand. At a bustling JFK gate, 17-year-old Amara is publicly shamed for dreaming of the sky, her worth measured by the cheapness of her seat. The pilot, a man of power and prestige, sees only a child out of her depth. But he's made a critical error, one that will unravel his career in the most spectacular fashion. Because what he doesn't know is that just beyond the gate, a revolutionary private jet sits waiting on the tarmac, a jet with Amara's name painted on its fuselage. This isn't just a story about a flight, it's a story of karma, delivered at 40,000 feet. The air in John F. Kennedy International Airport's Terminal 4 was a familiar chaotic symphony. The rhythmic clatter of rolling suitcases, the cacophony of overlapping announcements, and the low hum of thousands of conversations created a soundscape of perpetual motion. For 17-year-old Amara Washington, it was the sound of possibility, the prelude to an ascent into the heavens she had adored since she was a little girl. But on this humid June afternoon, the familiar hum felt discordant, laced with a tension that coiled in her stomach. She clutched her boarding pass, the flimsy paper already soft and creased from her nervous grip. The logo for Ascend Air, a budget airline known for its no-frills approach and rock-bottom prices, was printed in a faded blue. To Amara, this ticket wasn't a symbol of cheap travel. It was a marvel of logistics and engineering, a passport to the sky that cost less than a pair of designer sneakers. It represented a promise that for a small price, anyone could touch the clouds. Her gate, B-23, was a hive of activity. Passengers jostled for position, anxiously checking their phones and trying to catch the eye of the gate agents. Amara, with her worn backpack and simple clothes, felt a familiar sense of invisibility in the crowd. She was used to it. A quiet, observant girl with her head often buried in books about astrophysics and aeronautical design. She rarely commanded attention. That was, until the flight crew arrived. They moved through the crowd like sharks parting a school of fish. Leading them was the captain, a man who wore his uniform like a second skin. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with silver-streaked hair and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from granite. His name tag read Captain Rostein. He carried an air of unshakable authority, his eyes sweeping over the waiting passengers with a look that bordered on disdain. His gaze snagged on Amara for a fraction of a second, a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher, before moving on. The boarding process began, a frantic shuffle of zones and seat numbers. Amara's ticket was for Zone 5, the last to board. She waited patiently, leaning against a pillar and watching the other passengers. She saw families, business travelers, and students, all a part of this temporary airborne community. As the final boarding call echoed through the terminal, Amara made her way to the front. She handed her ticket and ID to the gate agent, a harried-looking woman who barely glanced at her. "Enjoy your flight," the agent said, her voice monotone. Amara smiled. "Thank you, I will." She was about to step into the jet bridge when Captain Rostein, who had been conversing with the first officer near the cockpit door, turned. He had overheard her, and a smirk played on his lips. He stepped forward, casually blocking her path. "Hold on a second," he said, his voice a low baritone that carried an unmistakable edge of condescension. He gestured towards her boarding pass, which the gate agent was still holding. "Is that a Zone 5 ticket?" Amara's smile faltered. She nodded, confused. "Yes, Captain." He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. He looked at his first officer, a younger man who shuffled his feet uncomfortably. "A Zone 5, last one on, first one off. If you're lucky." The first officer offered a weak, non-committal smile. The passengers still shuffling down the jet bridge slowed, their interest piqued by the exchange. Rostein's gaze returned to Amara, his eyes crinkling at the corners as if he were sharing a private joke. "You know, we have a little bet in the cockpit," he said, his voice loud enough for those nearby to hear. "We try to guess the story behind our last-minute rock-bottom fare passengers, running away from home, a last-ditch effort to catch a boyfriend who's moved on." A flush of heat crept up Amara's neck. Humiliation, sharp and hot, pricked at her eyes. She could feel the stares of the other passengers, their curiosity now mixed with pity. Her dream of the sky was being trampled on, reduced to a cheap punchline. "No, sir," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm just going to visit my mother." Rostein's smirk widened. "Your mother, right? Well, I hope for her sake this old bird," he patted the side of the fuselage, "doesn't have any hiccups. Ascendair isn't exactly known for its 5-star service, or its maintenance record for that matter." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Let me give you a piece of advice, kid. If you want to fly with any real class, you need to be able to afford more than just the scraps. This," he flicked a dismissive finger towards her ticket, "is for the bottom feeders." The cruelty of his words, so casually delivered, stole her breath. It wasn't just about the cheap ticket anymore. It was about her presence, her right to be there. He had looked at her, a young black girl with a backpack and a dream, and seen nothing of value. Tears threatened, but she blinked them back, refusing to give him the satisfaction. She lifted her chin, her gaze meeting his without flinching. "Flying is flying, Captain," she said, her voice trembling slightly but clear. "The physics don't change just because the ticket is cheaper." For a moment, Rostein seemed taken aback by her directness. The smirk faltered, replaced by a flash of irritation. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by a teenager holding a budget ticket. "Cute," he sneered. "Just try not to cause any trouble in the back, and don't press the call button unless the plane is actually going down." He turned his back on her then, a final, dismissive gesture that rendered her invisible once more. He strode into the cockpit, his laughter echoing softly behind him. The first officer gave her a quick, apologetic glance before following him in. Amara stood frozen in the jet bridge, the weight of 100 pairs of eyes pressing down on her. The whispers started, a low murmur that felt like a physical blow. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the grimy carpeting. But then a different feeling began to surface, pushing through the shame and anger. It was a cold, hard resolve. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know what she was capable of. He saw a cheap ticket and made his judgment. He had no idea that this flight for him was just another routine trip. For her, it was a stepping stone to something he couldn't even comprehend. With a deep breath, she walked onto the plane, her head held high. She found her seat at the very back, next to a rattling lavatory. As she squeezed into the cramped space, she looked out the small, scratched window at the sprawling tarmac of JFK. Her eyes scanned the private hangars in the distance, the sleek, beautiful jets parked like resting predators. Her gaze settled on one in particular. It was a stunning aircraft, its design unlike any other. Its lines were fluid and impossibly graceful, its wings swept back like a falcon's. It was painted a deep, iridescent midnight blue, and emblazoned on its tail in elegant silver script was a single word, Amara. A slow smile spread across her face, a genuine smile this time, full of a secret knowledge that was hers alone. Captain Rostein thought he had put her in her place. He had no idea she was exactly where she was supposed to be, and soon, very soon, he would learn that the sky belonged to everyone, but the future of flight belonged to those who dared to build it. The Ascendair flight was as unpleasant as Captain Rostein had implicitly promised. The cabin was stuffy, the seat cushion felt thin and worn, and a faint, vaguely unpleasant smell hung in the air. Amara did her best to ignore it all, pressing her forehead against the cool plastic of the window. She watched as JFK's familiar landmark slid by beneath them, the iconic TWA Flight Center, the sprawling cargo bays, the endless procession of planes taking off and landing. As her plane, a lumbering, aging Boeing 737, finally lifted off the runway with a shudder and a groan, she kept her eyes fixed on the private hangar. She watched until the sleek midnight blue jet with her name on it was just a tiny speck, a secret promise she held close to her heart. The flight to Atlanta was short, but it felt like an eternity. Amara kept to herself, her mind a whirlwind of schematics, thrust-to-weight ratios, and the stinging memory of Rostein's words, bottom feeders. The term echoed in her mind, a bitter pill she refused to swallow. He had no idea. He saw the surface, the cheap ticket, and assumed he knew the whole story. He couldn't have been more wrong. Her mother, Dr. Eris Washington, was waiting for her just beyond the security checkpoint at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. Eris was a force of nature, a woman whose brilliance was matched only by her warmth. A leading aerospace engineer, she had been a trailblazer in her field, the driving force behind some of the most innovative advancements in aviation technology. "There's my girl," Eris said, her face breaking into a radiant smile as she enveloped Amara in a hug. "How was the flight?" Amara hugged her back tightly, the familiar scent of her mother's perfume a comforting balm. "It flew," she said with a small shrug. "But the captain was a piece of work." Eris's smile tightened. "Oh? What happened?" As they walked towards the parking garage, Amara recounted the encounter with Captain Rostein. She didn't embellish. She didn't need to. The simple, unvarnished truth of his condescension was enough. Aris listened patiently, her expression growing colder and harder with each word. "He called you a bottom feeder?" Aris asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "Among other things," Amara confirmed. They reached her mother's car, a modest electric vehicle that belied her considerable success. Aris unlocked the doors but didn't move to get in. She turned to Amara, her eyes blazing with a protective fire. "Some people," Aris said, her voice filled with a steely conviction, "can only feel big by making others feel small. They build their pedestals on the backs of others, and they're terrified of anyone who might shake them. That man with his fancy uniform and his inflated ego is threatened by people like you, Amara. He's threatened by the future you represent." "I just wanted to get on the plane," Amara said quietly. "I know, baby. But you did more than that. You stood your ground, you held your head high. I'm proud of you." Eris cupped Amara's face in her hands. "And don't you ever for 1 second let anyone make you feel like you don't belong. You belong in the sky more than any of them." Her mother's words were a shield, deflecting the last of the hurt and leaving only a simmering indignation. They drove not to a house, but to a private airfield on the outskirts of Atlanta. As they passed through the security gate, Amara's heart began to beat a little faster. This was her real destination, her true home. And there it was, the Amara. It was even more beautiful up close. The midnight blue paint seemed to absorb the Georgia sun, the silver script of its name shimmering like a heat haze. It wasn't just a plane, it was a masterpiece, a marvel of engineering and design, a testament to her mother's genius and, in a small but significant way, her own. For the past 3 years, Amara had been more than just an observer. She had been her mother's apprentice. While other kids were at the mall or playing video games, Amara was in the workshop, learning about composite materials, studying fluid dynamics, and even helping to design the custom avionics suite that made the Amara one of the most advanced private jets in the world. The jet wasn't just named after her, it was a part of her. "Ready to see the latest upgrades?" Aris asked, a playful glint in her eye. Amara's face lit up, all thoughts of Captain Rostein and his petty cruelty vanishing like a contrail in the wind. "Did you finish the integration of the new sensor package?" "Even better," Aris said, leading her up the stairs and into the cabin. "I think we finally solved the turbulence-dampening algorithm." The interior of the Amara was the antithesis of the Ascend airplane. The cabin was spacious and elegant, with plush leather seats, polished wood accents, and state-of-the-art technology seamlessly integrated into the design. But it was the cockpit that was Amara's sanctuary. It was a symphony of glass panels and touchscreens, the traditional yoke replaced with a sleek, responsive side stick. This was the future, and she understood every single button, every display, every line of code that made it all work. For the next few hours, mother and daughter worked together, a seamless team united by their shared passion. They ran diagnostics, calibrated instruments, and debated the finer points of aeronautical engineering. This was where Amara belonged, in the heart of innovation, pushing the boundaries of what was possible. Later that evening, as they sat in the quiet cabin, sipping sodas and looking out at the sunset painting the sky in fiery colors, Eris's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her brow furrowing. "That's odd," she said. "What is it?" Amara asked. "It's a message from Marcus Thorne," Eris said, referring to a trusted contact at the FAA. "He's forwarding a Priority 1 alert." She read the message, her eyes widening slightly. An Ascend Air 737, Flight 428 from JFK to Atlanta, has had to make an emergency landing. A complete electrical failure. They've been diverted to a small private airfield in rural North Carolina. No power, no communication, and a storm is rolling in. Amara's blood ran cold. Flight 428. That was her flight. That was Captain Rostein's flight. Eris looked at Amara, a slow, calculating expression on her face. The airfield is called Blackwood Strip. It's small, barely a runway. They can't handle a commercial jet, and the storm is going to make it impossible for another one to land there for at least 24 hours. The passengers are stranded. A strange, dizzying feeling washed over Amara. The universe, it seemed, had a flair for the dramatic. They need a specialized electrical component to even have a chance of getting the plane running again. Eris continued reading from her phone. A component that's rare and not readily available. It would have to be flown in. She paused, looking from her phone to the magnificent jet that surrounded them, and then to her daughter. A slow, wolfish grin spread across Eris's face. "It just so happens," she said, her voice dripping with irony, "that we have one of those components right here. In fact, we have a prototype that's even better than the standard model." Amara's heart pounded in her chest. She understood immediately. The implications, the beautiful poetic justice of it all, crashed down on her in a wave. "And," Eris added, her grin widening, "it seems the only aircraft capable of landing on a short, unlit runway in rapidly deteriorating weather conditions, that is also close enough to help, is currently sitting on a private airfield outside of Atlanta." She looked at her daughter, her eyes sparkling with a mixture of pride and righteous mischief. "So what do you say, Amara?" she asked. "Feel like taking a ride in your jet?" The news hit the cockpit of Ascend Air Flight 428 like a physical blow. One moment, Captain Rostein was complaining to his first officer, Mark, about the quality of the in-flight coffee. The next, a cascade of alerts lit up their control panel like a Christmas tree, each one a harbinger of doom. "What the hell?" Rostein snapped, his casual arrogance vanishing in an instant. He scanned the instruments, his experienced eyes trying to make sense of the chaos. "Main bus failure. Standby power not engaging. We're losing everything." The cabin lights flickered and died, plunging the passengers into a semi-darkness broken only by the emergency exit signs. A collective gasp rippled through the plane, followed by a rising murmur of fear. The reassuring hum of the engines was replaced by a terrifying silence, and the plane, no longer under full control, began to feel heavy and unresponsive. "Mayday, mayday, mayday," Mark said into the radio, his voice a testament to years of training, calm and collected on the surface, but with an undercurrent of barely controlled panic. "Ascend 428. We have a complete electrical failure. Requesting immediate vectors to the nearest available runway." The response from air traffic control was grim. The nearest major airport was too far. Their only option was a small private landing strip called Blackwood Strip, a place Rostein had only ever seen on maps, a tiny, insignificant speck in the vast expanse of rural North Carolina. It was a place for crop dusters and hobbyists, not for a 150,000-pound commercial airliner. Landing the crippled 737 on a short, unlit runway in the middle of nowhere was the most terrifying experience of Rostein's 30-year career. It was a testament to his skill as a pilot that he managed to get the plane down in one piece, but the landing was rough. A bone-jarring, teeth-rattling affair that sent luggage tumbling from the overhead bins and drew screams from the terrified passengers. The moment the plane screeched to a halt, the reality of their situation sank in. They were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense forest, with a dead plane and no way to call for help. The storm that had been a distant threat on the horizon was now rolling in fast, the sky turning a bruised purple gray. Rothstein, his face pale and beaded with sweat, tried to maintain a veneer of command. He addressed the passengers over the emergency PA system, his voice strained but authoritative. He assured them that the situation was under control, that help was on the way. But as he looked out at the darkening woods and the single dilapidated hangar that constituted Blackwood Strip, he knew he was lying. Hours passed. The cabin grew hot and stuffy. The passengers, their initial fear giving way to a restless anxiety, began to grumble. Children cried. The elderly looked frail and vulnerable. And Rothstein, for the first time in his career, felt a profound sense of powerlessness. His uniform, usually a symbol of his authority, now felt like a costume. He was just a man, trapped in a metal tube, with 150 lives depending on him. His frustration grew with each passing minute. He cursed Ascend Air for their shoddy maintenance, for their cost-cutting measures that had led to this. He cursed the weather. He cursed his luck. And in the dark recesses of his mind, he found himself thinking of the girl, the Zone 5 girl, the one he had so casually dismissed. He could almost hear her words, her quiet, defiant statement. The physics don't change just because the ticket is cheaper. The irony was not lost on him. He, the captain of this state-of-the-art, albeit poorly maintained aircraft, was now grounded, his fate in the hands of others. And she, the bottom feeder, was probably already at her destination, her cheap ticket having successfully delivered her to her mother. It was Mark who finally managed to get a signal on his personal cell phone, a weak one-bar connection that was just enough to get a message out. He contacted Ascend Air's emergency response team, who in turn contacted the FAA. The news that came back was not good. The component they needed to repair the electrical system, a highly specialized power distribution unit, was not something that could be found at the local hardware store. The nearest one was in a warehouse in Atlanta, and with the storm grounding all commercial flights in the region, there was no way to get it to them. They were looking at a minimum of 24 to 48 hours before they could even think about getting the plane off the ground. The news spread through the cabin like a virus, and the already tense atmosphere curdled into one of near mutiny. Rothstein, his authority crumbling, retreated to the cockpit, a king in a fallen castle. It was then that another message came through, this one from the FAA, patched through via a satellite link. It was a message that at first made no sense to him. "Captain Rothstein," the voice on the other end said, a calm, professional FAA controller. "We have a potential solution for you. A private aircraft is en route to your location with the necessary component. They are equipped for short-field, low-visibility landings. They are the only ones who can get to you." A sliver of hope, the first he had felt in hours, pierced through Rothstein's despair. A private aircraft? Who? What airline? There was a pause on the other end. "It's not an airline, Captain. It's a privately owned and operated vessel. A developmental prototype, actually. It's called the Amara." The name meant nothing to him. It was just a name, a strange, exotic name for a strange, exotic plane that was coming to his rescue. "The Amara," he repeated, the name feeling foreign on his tongue. "All right, tell them to hurry, and tell them I'll be eternally grateful." "They'll be there in under an hour, Captain," the controller said. "And there's one more thing you should know. The lead engineer on this project, the one who designed the component you need and is overseeing its delivery, she's on board." Good, Rothstein said, his mind already racing ahead, planning the logistics of the repair. "What's her name? I'll want to thank her personally." Another pause, this one longer, more deliberate. When the controller spoke again, his voice was tinged with something Rothstein couldn't quite identify. It sounded almost like amusement. "Her name," the controller said, enunciating each syllable with a crisp precision, "is Dr. Eris Washington, and she's traveling with her daughter." Rothstein's blood ran cold. Washington. A common enough name, but still, a cold, dreadful premonition began to creep up his spine. The Zone 5 girl. Hadn't she said she was going to visit her mother? He shook his head, dismissing the thought as a ridiculous coincidence. It couldn't be. The odds were astronomical. The world was not that small and karma was not that precise. But as the first drops of rain began to streak down the cockpit window, and a faint, futuristic hum began to cut through the sound of the wind, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to come face to face with a truth he was not prepared to accept. He was about to learn that the universe, in its infinite and often cruel sense of humor, had a way of balancing the books, and his account, he suspected, was severely overdrawn. The Amara cut through the storm-choked sky with an eerie grace. Inside the hyper-advanced cockpit, there was no turbulence. The revolutionary dampening system, the one Aris and Amara had been perfecting just hours before, absorbed the violent whims of the storm, rendering it little more than a visual spectacle on the panoramic displays. Rain lashed against the fuselage, and lightning spider-webbed across the clouds, but the jet flew on, a serene bubble of technological mastery in the heart of the tempest. Amara sat in the co-pilot's seat, her hands hovering over the controls, her gaze flicking between the flight data and the forward-facing infrared camera display. The image it projected was a ghostly, heat-mapped landscape of the world below, the dense forest a cool blue, the crippled 737 a fading, lukewarm shape on the short, dark runway of Blackwood Strip. "Runway in sight," she said, her voice a calm counterpoint to the storm outside. "Deploying landing gear, initiating final approach sequence." Her mother, seated behind her at a mobile engineering console, nodded in approval. "Looking good, sweetheart. The crosswinds are picking up, but you're handling it perfectly." There was no fear in Amara's heart, only a focused, exhilarating sense of purpose. This was the ultimate test, not just for the jet, but for her. Every lesson, every late night in the workshop, every line of code she had ever written, had led to this moment. She expertly guided the jet down, its powerful engines whispering where the 737s had roared. The landing was so smooth, so impossibly soft, that it felt less like a landing and more like an arrival. The Amara touched down on the wet tarmac with a barely perceptible sigh, its advanced braking system bringing it to a swift, controlled stop with yards to spare. For a long moment, the only sound in the cockpit was the drumming of the rain and the soft hum of the jet's systems. Then, Aris spoke, a slow smile spreading across her face. "Well," she said, "I do believe we've made our point." On board the stranded 737, the arrival of the Amara was an almost religious experience. The passengers, who had been huddled in the dark and stuffy cabin for hours, pressed their faces to the windows, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and disbelief. The jet looked like something from the future, a vessel of impossible grace and power. It didn't just land, it descended, an angel of deliverance in the heart of the storm. In the cockpit, Captain Rostein watched its arrival with a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. The jet was a marvel, a work of art, and the name Amara, which he had dismissed as just a name, now felt like a brand, searing itself into his consciousness. The main cabin door of the Amara opened, a smooth, silent hydraulic motion that was a stark contrast to the clunky manual operation of his own plane's doors. A ramp extended, and two figures emerged, silhouetted against the bright interior lights of the jet. One was a woman, tall and confident, her face a mask of determined focus. The other was a teenager, a girl in simple clothes with a backpack slung over her shoulder. And as they drew closer, walking across the wet tarmac with a purpose that bordered on regal, the floodlights from the smaller jet illuminated her face. It was her, the Zone 5 girl, the bottom feeder. Rostein felt the blood drain from his face. It was as if the world had tilted on its axis, sending him tumbling into a new, terrifying reality where everything he thought he knew was wrong. The coincidence was too great, the irony too profound. This wasn't chance. This was a reckoning. He stumbled out of the cockpit, his legs feeling weak and unsteady. He met them at the door of his plane, the rain plastering his silver-streaked hair to his scalp, his immaculate uniform now soaked and pathetic. Heiress Washington stopped before him, her eyes cold and sharp as ice. She didn't offer a greeting. She simply stated a fact. "Captain Rostein, I'm Dr. Heiress Washington. We're here to help." Rostein could only nod, his voice lost somewhere in his throat. His gaze drifted past her to Amara, who stood just behind her mother, her expression unreadable. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't smiling. She was just watching him. And in her quiet, steady gaze, he saw not the reflection of his own prejudice, but the quiet confidence of someone who knew her worth, who had always known it. "This is my lead engineer," Heiress said, gesturing to her daughter, Amara. "She'll be overseeing the installation of the new power distribution unit." The words hit Rostein with the force of a physical blow. Lead engineer. Not just a passenger, not just a visitor, but the lead engineer. The girl he had mocked, the child he had belittled, held the key to his salvation. I don't understand," he stammered, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. "No," Heiress said, her voice cutting through the sound of the storm. "I don't suppose you do." She looked from Rostein to the dark, silent plane behind him, and then back to the captain, her gaze withering. "You see a budget airline ticket and you make an assumption. You see a young black girl and you make another. It never occurs to you that the girl you dismissed as a bottom feeder might just be the one person on this planet who can get you out of this mess." Shame, hot and suffocating, washed over Rostein. He had never felt so small, so utterly and completely humbled. His arrogance, his pride, his carefully constructed sense of superiority, it all lay in ruins at his feet, shattered by the arrival of this impossible girl and her impossible jet. Amara stepped forward then, her eyes meeting his. She wasn't angry. She wasn't smug. She was just focused. "Captain," she said, her voice clear and steady, "we don't have much time. The storm is getting worse. With your permission, my team and I would like to get to work." He could only nod, a puppet whose strings had been cut. He stepped aside, a disgraced king abdicating his throne. And as Amara and her mother, followed by a small team of technicians from their jet, brushed past him and entered the dark, dead shell of his aircraft, he knew that this was more than just a rescue. It was a lesson, a brutal, humbling, and utterly unforgettable lesson. And as he stood there in the rain, a forgotten relic on the edge of a new era, he watched as the future of flight, in the form of a quiet, brilliant teenage girl, walked past him to go and fix the mess he was in. The interior of the 737's avionics bay was a cramped, chaotic space, a tangled mess of wires and circuits that had been thrown into disarray by the massive electrical surge. For the Ascend Air maintenance crew, it would have been a nightmare, a multi-day job requiring a team of specialists. For Amara, it was a puzzle, a complex, fascinating puzzle that she was uniquely qualified to solve. She moved with a quiet efficiency that belied her age, her slender fingers tracing wires, her eyes scanning schematics on a tablet that she propped against a bulkhead. She directed her small team with a calm authority, her voice never rising above a steady, confident tone. "We need to isolate the main bus first," she said, pointing to a diagram. "Then we can bypass the damaged conduits and install the new PDU. It's a custom fit, so we'll need to be precise." Captain Rostein stood at the edge of the bay, a useless, hulking presence in a space where his authority meant nothing. He watched in stunned silence as the girl he had ridiculed took command, her knowledge and expertise undeniable. She spoke a language he barely understood, a dialect of engineering and physics that was as foreign to him as an ancient, forgotten tongue. He saw the way her team looked at her, with a respect that bordered on reverence. He saw the way her mother, the brilliant Dr. Heiress Washington, watched her daughter with a pride that was so fierce it was almost palpable. And he saw the way Amara herself, so unassuming just hours before, was transformed in this element, a master craftsman in her workshop. The passengers, their faces pressed against the windows of the main cabin, watched the activity with a growing sense of hope. They didn't know the details of the drama that had unfolded, but they understood one thing. Help had arrived, and it had arrived in the most unexpected of forms. Mark, the first officer, stood beside Rostein, his expression a mixture of awe and embarrassment. He remembered his own uncomfortable silence when Rostein had made his cruel jokes. He had been complicit, a bystander to an act of casual cruelty, and the weight of that inaction now settled heavily on his conscience. "She's incredible," Mark whispered, his voice full of a genuine admiration that twisted the knife of shame in Rostein's gut. Rostein didn't answer. He couldn't. What could he say? That he had misjudged her, that he had been a fool? The words were inadequate, hollow apologies for a sin that felt unforgivable. After nearly 2 hours of intense, focused work, Amara's voice cut through the quiet hum of activity. "Okay," she said, wiping a smudge of grease from her cheek with the back of her hand. "I think that's it. We're ready to try and power it up." A hush fell over the avionics bay. Amara looked at her mother, who gave her a reassuring nod. Then she looked at Rostein. "Captain," she said, her gaze steady and direct, "you should be the one to do it." It was a gesture of professional courtesy, a small but significant acknowledgement of his position. But to Rostein, it felt like a test, a chance to reclaim a tiny sliver of his shattered dignity. He nodded, his throat tight, and made his way to the cockpit. He slid into his seat, the familiar leather creaking under his weight. The cockpit was dark and lifeless, a tomb. He took a deep breath, his hand hovering over the switch that would, he hoped, bring his metal beast back to life. He looked through the cockpit door, his eyes finding Amara, who was watching him from the avionics bay. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Go ahead." He flipped the switch. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. And then, with a soft whir that grew into a steady hum, the cockpit flickered to life. The displays lit up one by one, their familiar green glow a welcome sight in the darkness. The cabin lights came on, and a cheer erupted from the passengers. The plane was alive again. Relief, so powerful it was almost painful, washed over Rostein. He sank back in his seat, the tension of the last few hours draining out of him, leaving him feeling weak and hollowed out. He had been saved by the very person he had tried to humiliate. Later, as the storm began to break and the first rays of dawn painted the eastern sky, Rostein knew what he had to do. He found Amara and her mother preparing the Amara for their departure. He stopped before them, a humbled man stripped of his pride. I don't know what to say," he began, his voice raspy. Eris looked at him, her expression unyielding. "Then perhaps you should say nothing." "No," Rostein said, shaking his head. "I have to." He looked at Amara, his eyes filled with a shame so profound it was almost painful to witness. "I was wrong," he said, the words feeling like shards of glass in his throat. "What I said to you, it was inexcusable. It was cruel, and it was born from an arrogance I can no longer justify. I am deeply, truly sorry." Amara looked at him, her expression thoughtful. She didn't offer him the easy comfort of a quick forgiveness. She simply nodded, a quiet acknowledgement of his apology. "But an apology isn't enough," Rostein continued, his voice cracking. He knew he had to do more, to make this right in a way that would have a lasting impact. "I have a responsibility, to my passengers, to my crew, to the truth." He turned and walked back to his plane, his steps heavy with the weight of his newfound humility. He stood at the door where he had once blocked Amara's path, and addressed the passengers who were now milling about, stretching their legs and breathing the fresh, rain-washed air. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice amplified by the PA system, carrying across the tarmac. "I owe you all an explanation and an apology." He proceeded to tell them everything. He didn't spare himself. He recounted his words to Amara at the gate, his condescending tone, his cruel jokes. He laid his prejudice and his arrogance bare for all to see. The passengers listened in stunned silence, their initial relief at being rescued now tinged with a collective sense of shock and disapproval. "The young woman who just saved us all," Rostein said, his voice thick with emotion as he gestured towards Amara, "is the same young woman I tried to humiliate. She is a brilliant engineer, a true visionary, and I was a fool." He looked at Amara, his eyes pleading for an absolution he knew he didn't deserve. "I hope that one day you'll be able to forgive me, but I will never forgive myself." The silence that followed was broken by a single sound: applause. It started with one passenger, a woman in the front row, and then spread through the crowd, a wave of acknowledgement and respect, directed not at the humbled captain, but at the quiet girl who stood beside her futuristic jet. Amara watched it all, a whirlwind of emotions swirling within her. She felt a sense of vindication, yes, but also something else. A quiet sadness for a man so blinded by his own prejudice that he couldn't see the brilliance standing right in front of him. As the sun rose higher, casting a golden glow over the scene, Amara knew that this was a moment she would never forget. It was a moment of karma, yes, but it was also a moment of profound, painful, and ultimately necessary change. A king had been humbled, a girl had been vindicated, and the sky, it seemed, had a way of ensuring that everyone, eventually, finds their proper place within it. The story of Ascend Air Flight 428 and its miraculous rescue by a mysterious futuristic jet did not stay confined to the remote runway of Blackwood Strip. In the age of social media, news travels at the speed of light. Passengers, now armed with fully charged phones, began to post their accounts of the ordeal. They posted pictures of the dead 737, the dramatic storm, and the sleek midnight blue jet that had descended from the heavens. But most of all, they told the story of the captain's confession. The tale of the arrogant pilot and the brilliant teenage girl he had belittled went viral. #PilotShame and #Amara the Angel trended on Twitter for days. Aviation bloggers picked up the story, followed by mainstream news outlets. The narrative was too perfect, too rich with irony and karmic justice to ignore. For Captain Rostein, the fallout was swift and brutal. By the time he landed the now repaired 737 in Atlanta, Ascend Air's corporate office was in full-blown crisis mode. An internal investigation was launched, but it was a mere formality. With dozens of eyewitness accounts and his own public confession, the verdict was already in. He was suspended, pending a full review. But he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that he would never fly for a commercial airline again. His 30-year career, his pride and his passion, had been destroyed by a few moments of casual cruelty. The world he had once commanded, the sky he had once ruled, was now closed to him. He became a pariah, a cautionary tale whispered in cockpits and crew lounges around the world. The man who had been humbled by a Zone 5 ticket. But the consequences didn't stop there. The incident shone a harsh, unforgiving light on Ascend Air, the story of their catastrophic electrical failure, a direct result of their cost-cutting on maintenance and parts, became a lead story. The FAA launched a full-scale investigation into their operations, grounding a significant portion of their fleet and levying a fine so massive it threatened the airline's very existence. Their stock plummeted. Passengers, spooked by the near disaster and disgusted by the story of their captain's behavior, canceled their bookings in droves. The airline that had built its brand on being cheap was now paying the ultimate price. For Amara and her mother, the aftermath was of a different nature entirely. The world was fascinated by the Amara, the mystery of the advanced jet. Its incredible capabilities and its enigmatic creators became the subject of intense speculation. The aerospace industry, a world of titans and legacy corporations, was abuzz. Who was Dr. Eris Washington, and who was the daughter she had named her revolutionary creation after? They were inundated with offers, from venture capitalists who wanted to invest, from military contractors who wanted to weaponize their technology, and from commercial airlines who wanted to license their designs. Eris, with her characteristic shrewdness, navigated the storm of attention with a deft hand. She and Amara gave a single exclusive interview to a leading aviation journal, telling their story in their own words. They spoke of their passion for innovation, their desire to make air travel safer and more efficient, and their belief that the future of flight lay in pushing the boundaries of what was possible. They didn't mention Captain Rothstein by name. They didn't have to. The world already knew his story. In the end, they accepted an offer not from a corporation, but from a philanthropic foundation dedicated to advancing science and technology education. The funding would allow them to continue their research, to build a small fleet of Amara-class jets, and most importantly, to establish a program to mentor and inspire the next generation of engineers, particularly young women and students from underrepresented communities. A few months later, Amara stood on the tarmac of their expanded facility near Atlanta, watching as a group of high school students, their faces alight with wonder, toured the gleaming interior of the Amara. She saw herself in them, in their curiosity, in their passion, in their dreams of touching the sky. A letter had arrived a few weeks prior. It was from Rothstein. It was a short, simple, handwritten note. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't make excuses. He just said that he was trying to be a better man, and that he wished her all the best. He had enclosed a check, a significant portion of his severance pay, with a request that it be donated to a charity of her choice. She had added it to the fund for her new mentorship program. Her mother came to stand beside her, putting a proud arm around her shoulder. "Look at them," Aris said, her voice soft. "That's the future, right there." Amara nodded, a slow smile spreading across her face. "Yes," she said, "it is." She looked up at the vast blue expanse above them, a canvas of infinite possibility. She thought of Captain Rothstein, a man grounded by his own prejudice, and of herself, a girl who had been told she belonged at the back of the plane. The sky, she knew, had a way of testing you. It tested your skill, your courage, your resolve. But most of all, it tested your character. It had a way of stripping away the non-essential, of revealing the truth of who you are. For Captain Rothstein, the sky had been a mirror, reflecting his own ugliness back at him. For Amara, it was a promise that with enough passion, enough intelligence, and enough determination, there were no limits to how high you could fly. And as she watched the next generation of dreamers step into her world, she knew with a certainty that resonated deep in her soul that her own journey was just beginning. The sky was not her limit. It was her starting point. 3 years later, the world had spun on its axis 1,000 times, and the ripples from that fateful day at Blackwood Strip had spread out, changing the landscape of not just a few lives, but an entire industry. Ascendair was a ghost, a memory recounted in business textbooks as a cautionary tale of hubris and neglect. In its wake, a new consciousness had taken root in aviation. The Amara Standard had become an industry term, a shorthand for a new philosophy that prioritized cutting-edge safety technology and human-centric design over cutting costs. The story of Flight 428 had forced a reckoning, and the skies were safer for it. The Washington Aviation Initiative, born from a moment of crisis and funded by a wave of goodwill, had blossomed into a beacon of hope. Their headquarters was no longer just a single hangar, but a sprawling campus of research labs and workshops, a place where the brightest young minds came to dream and to build. Amara, now 20 and pursuing her doctorate in aerospace engineering at MIT, was the heart of the initiative. She spent her weekends and holidays not at parties, but in the cockpit of the Amara II, mentoring the next wave of innovators. Her latest protege was a fiery, brilliant 16-year-old from the inner city named Maya. Maya had a mind like a steel trap and a skepticism for authority that reminded Amara of her younger self. Today they were co-piloting a test flight, soaring at 45,000 feet over the Atlantic, the curve of the Earth a breathtaking blue arc on the horizon. "The telemetry looks perfect," Maya said, her eyes scanning the glass displays with a practiced ease. "The micro-adjustments to the winglet actuators are responding even faster than the simulations predicted." That's because you accounted for the atmospheric density shift at this altitude, Amara said with a proud smile. Your code is flawless. Maya beamed, a rare, unreserved expression of joy. In this cockpit, she wasn't a kid from a rough neighborhood. She was a pioneer. It was on their return, as they began their descent towards a small municipal airport in coastal Maine for a routine landing, that Amara saw him. The airport was a quiet place, mostly serving local hobbyists and a small flight school. As they taxied towards their designated spot, Amara's gaze drifted over to a small, single-engine Cessna parked near a modest training building. A man was pre-flighting the aircraft, his movements slow and methodical. He was older, his hair now completely white, and he carried himself with a stooped posture that spoke of a heavy, invisible weight. It was Rostein. Amara's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't seen or thought of him in years, not beyond the abstract memory of the man who had inadvertently launched her career. Seeing him here in the flesh was a jolt. He wore no fancy uniform, only a simple polo shirt and worn khaki pants. The arrogant king of the sky was gone, replaced by a quiet, unassuming flight instructor. Maya noticed her change in demeanor. Everything okay, Amara? Amara hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Yeah, just saw someone I used to know. She watched as a young, nervous-looking student approached Rostein. She saw Rostein turn, a gentle, patient smile on his face. He put a reassuring hand on the student's shoulder, pointing to something on the wing, his voice too low to hear but his body language speaking volumes. It was kind, encouraging, paternal. It was everything he hadn't been to her. A strange mix of emotions washed over Amara. The last vestiges of old anger had long since faded, replaced by a quiet pity. Now even that was dissolving, leaving behind something more complex, a sense of a circle being completed, of a debt being paid in a way she never could have imagined. His punishment wasn't just being grounded, it was being remade. After they had secured the jet, Amara felt an impulse she couldn't explain. I'll be right back, she told Maya, and walked across the tarmac. Rostein was just finishing with his student, sending him off to file a flight plan. He turned and his eyes met Amara's. Recognition dawned slowly, followed by a wave of profound, weary shame. He looked down at his shoes, then back up at her, his face a canvas of regret. Miss Washington, he said, his voice quiet, raspy. I had heard you were doing great things. It's an honor to see you. It's Amara, she said softly. And you're Captain Rostein. A sad smile touched his lips. Not anymore. Just David now. I teach kids how not to be the man I was. The raw honesty of his confession was disarming. It looks like you're a good teacher, Amara said, glancing towards his departing student. I try, he said, his gaze distant. When you lose everything you thought defined you, you have a choice. You can become bitter, or you can try to build something better with the rubble. I chose to try. He finally met her eyes fully. I never properly thanked you, not just for saving my plane or my passengers, but for saving me. That day, it was the end of my life, but it was also the beginning of it. I wouldn't be here doing this, finding a peace I never knew in 30 years of flying jets, if it weren't for you. Amara felt the last knot of a long-held tension release within her. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was offering his testimony. He was showing her the final result of his karmic lesson. Not just punishment, but transformation. I'm glad you found peace, David, she said, and the words were genuine. She offered her hand. He looked at it for a moment, as if unworthy, then took it. His grip was firm, his hand calloused. The hand of a man who now worked for a living, no longer a commander who simply gave orders. As she walked back to her own magnificent jet, a creation that was a universe away from Rostein's humble Cessna, she felt a profound sense of closure. The story wasn't about his fall and her rise. It was about how one person's arrogance could create a storm, but how one person's grace could, in the end, lead to a clearing in the clouds for everyone. Back in the cockpit, Maya was waiting. So, who was that old guy? Amara settled into her seat, the controls of the most advanced aircraft on the planet feeling like an extension of her own body. She looked out at the endless sky, a realm that had humbled a king and elevated a girl. "He was just a pilot," Amara said, a gentle smile on her face. "Someone who taught me a very important lesson a long time ago." She pushed the throttle forward, and the Amara 2 rose silently, powerfully into the expanse, leaving the small airport and the ghosts of the past behind, climbing towards a future she was building not just for herself, but for all the dreamers who dared to look up. The sky is vast, but it has a long memory. The story of Amara and Captain Rostein isn't just about a single flight. It's a powerful reminder that our words have weight and our actions have consequences that can ripple out in ways we can never predict. A moment of arrogance brought a 30-year career to a humiliating end, while a young girl's quiet dignity and brilliance literally saved the day, paving the way for a brighter future. This is the ultimate story of karma, proving that true worth isn't determined by the price of your ticket, but by the content of your character and the power of your dreams. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and make sure you subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories of justice and empowerment. Don't forget to ring that notification bell so you never miss an update.